In the previous video, I mentioned the word destructive testing when I was explaining about when you test APIs, do you check the database or do you make a GET call? So in this video, I just want to explain what destructive and non-destructive testing is. So a destructive test is test that actually changes data or that will create data. And a lot of times we're not allowed to run those kinds of tests in production environment because data integrity in production environment is really important. You don't want to just create a bunch of sample test data in production environment. So production environment is the part of the application or version of the application that the entire public or your customers see. Usually you have a prod or production environment, and you have a test dev staging environment where you get to play around. You can just mess around with the data. But the production one is there's real data, real customer data, so you don't just mess it up. So an example of a destructive test would be create a user, create a product, delete a product, delete a user, right? Create something, delete something. Those kinds of tests, they actually destroy data. They actually create some new data or they delete data. So in production environment, you don't want to do that. You don't want to just create a bunch of random users. So of course you have to test creating users. So you have to create a reasonable number of users, but in test dev stage environment, you might be creating hundreds of users every day. If you have automation running, the automation is always creating users. You might have 10 different test cases that create users. So that means you're creating 10 users and you might be running it every hour. So you got all of a sudden 200 something users created in a day. So you don't want to run things like that in production. And non-destructive tests would be things like login, right? When you log in, you're not changing information. You already have the user, you're logging in with the user. And if you're doing API testing, anything that is a fetch that says get something, right? You make a get call. You're not destructive. You're not creating something. You're not changing something. You're just reading some information that exists. So that's non-destructive. So a lot of times in production environment, you run non-destructive tests, and then in testing and staging environments, you can run any kind of test, really what you want. But just because a test is non-destructive, that doesn't mean you can run it as much as you want, even in production, especially front-end. When you run a front-end test, you have to be aware of analytics, right? Let's say you're going to go to the homepage and log in. You're doing that 100 times. Because it's not destructive, you think it's okay to go and log in 100 times in a day, but that actually will affect analytics, right? There are teams that are paying attention to how many people are coming to your website, from where they're coming. There's analytics, so you have to make sure you communicate with them so they can either blacklist your IP address or somehow filter that traffic so your test traffic doesn't actually affect the analytics. So even though you're not changing data, but you can still affect analytics. So you got to be careful with that. All right. So that was just a little side note about what is a destructive and non-destructive test cases. If you're into QA, testing, or automation, make sure you give me a follow. All I do is create content related to that.